Right now, there's a fire burning inside you, not from an infection, not from an injury, from your own immune system slowly turning against you. And here's the paradox. The system that protects you is the same one accelerating every major disease of aging. Heart disease, cognitive decline, cancer, they all share a common upstream driver. And the numbers here are quite stark. A study of nearly 500,000 people, none of which had known cardiovascular disease, found that those with elevated inflammatory markers had a 61% higher risk of dying from cardiovascular disease and a 54% higher risk of dying from any cause at all. Most people have no idea that this is happening. Hi, I'm Dr. Cal, and as a doctor with 7 years' experience in the NHS, I've watched chronic inflammation play out in patients over and over again. Heart disease, diabetes, cognitive decline, the upstream driver is often the same. For this video, I've gone through 24 research papers, meta-analyses, randomized control trials, cohort studies, spanning hundreds of thousands of participants. Everyone is linked into a citation library in the description, so you can check out any of this research for yourself. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through 3 findings about chronic inflammation that I think change how we should approach our health. First, why inflammatory markers predict your risk of dying better than most things your doctor already tracks. Second, the self-reinforcing cellular cycle that keeps inflammation going once it starts. And the third, why this isn't an inevitable part of aging. There are 6 modifiable drivers that actually cause it. Then, if you stick around till the end, I'll walk you through an evidence-based intervention list that can actually lower chronic inflammation. Now, before we get into the 3 findings, it's worth understanding a basic distinction most people get wrong. Acute inflammation is a tightly regulated, time-limited immune response. Tissue damage or infection triggers a cascade of cytokines, so signaling molecules like IL-1 beta, TNF-alpha, and IL-6. Immune cells then migrate to the site and the threat gets neutralized, but then anti-inflammatory signals resolve the response. It's essential and protective. Think of it like a fire alarm. Something goes wrong, the alarm goes off, the fire brigade arrive, and the fire gets put out, the alarm switches off. That's acute inflammation. What we're talking about today is what happens when the alarm never switches off. Your immune system stays activated at a low level for months, years, and decades without a clear threat to fight. That's chronic low-grade inflammation, and it's a completely different problem. Researchers call this inflammaging. It was first defined in 2000, but is now recognized as one of the fundamental hallmarks of biological aging. What we know about this process changes what we should be testing for, what you should be doing about it, and what you can probably stop wasting your money on. Finding 1. Chronic inflammation predicts your risk of dying better than most markers out there. This first one's about scale. Chronic inflammation doesn't just contribute to disease, it predicts death more reliably than most of the risk factors your doctor already tracks. The marker at the center of all this is hsCRP, or high sensitivity C-reactive protein. It's produced by your liver in response to IL-6 signaling, and it integrates inflammatory activity from across the body into a single measurable value, a summary score for how much inflammation your body is dealing with at any one time. A team analysed data from over 448,000 people in the UK Biobank, none of which had known cardiovascular disease. Those with a hsCRP above 3 mg per litre had a 34% higher risk of major cardiovascular event, a 61% higher risk of cardiovascular death, and a 54% higher risk of all-cause mortality compared to those with values below 1. hsCRP outperformed conventional risk factors including systolic blood pressure and LDL cholesterol, and what's wild is that when it was added to the standard risk models, prediction improved by 14.1%. That's a meaningful reclassification of those who are actually at risk. And this pattern holds even at the extremes of age. Researchers studied over 1,500 people aged 85 and above, and this included some people past 100 and 105 years of age. Inflammation still predicted who would die and who wouldn't. It predicted physical capability and cognition better than chronological age or gender. You can also explore other inflammatory markers here too. In 80-year-olds followed for 6 years, IL-6 predicted mortality in both sexes and TNF-alpha predicted mortality in men, both independent of smoking, blood pressure, cholesterol, BMI, and every other traditional risk factor. So, If you're tracking your cholesterol but you've never measured your inflammatory markers, you're missing something that might matter more. Here's what to ask for. hsCRP, not standard CRP, specifically the high sensitivity version. Less than 1 milligram per litre is low risk, 1 to 3 is moderate, and above 3 is high risk. The data shows it's remarkably stable over time. Repeated measurements after 4.4 years showed long-term consistency, so a single test gives you a reliable baseline to work from. One caveat here is that inflammatory markers do rise with age in healthy people, but healthy older adults generally stay within normal ranges. Levels beyond age-expected norms signal disease, not just aging. Right, so that's what chronic inflammation predicts. What's actually driving it at a cellular level? This is where it gets interesting. Finding 2. Your own cells are fueling the fire. This one's about the mechanism. Chronic inflammation doesn't just happen to you, your own cells are actively perpetuating it through a self-reinforcing cycle. The core of the problem is cellular senescence, cells that have stopped dividing but haven't died. Instead, they enter a metabolically active state and start pumping out inflammatory signals. This is called the senescence-associated secretory phenotype, or SASP. Think of senescent cells as retired employees who refuse to leave the building. They spend all day setting off the fire alarms and they're not doing any useful work anymore. They're actually creating a constant state of emergency for every cell around them. Here's where it becomes a vicious cycle. Pro-inflammatory cytokines like TNF-alpha directly induce cellular senescence through reactive oxygen species and DNA damage pathways. But senescent cells then produce the very same cytokines that cause their senescence. Inflammation creates senescent cells creates more inflammation. It becomes a feed-forward amplification loop. There is another piece to the puzzle here, the NLRP3 inflammasome, a molecule platform inside immune cells that becomes increasingly activated with age. It's triggered by mitochondrial damage, oxidative stress, and cellular debris that accumulates as we get older, and it continuously generates IL-1 beta and IL-18, which drive further inflammatory gene expression, another layer of the same self-perpetuating problem. The clinical impact is measurable. Researchers created a composite inflammaging score by combining IL-6, IL-10, and CXCL9 and followed over 1,000 older adults for 10 years. Those with the highest scores had 2.42 times the mortality risk compared to those with the lowest. This explains why chronic inflammation doesn't just resolve on its own. Once the cycle gets going, it takes active intervention to break it. Your body won't spontaneously fix this, instead it adds to the problem. Okay, so the third and final finding challenges something that most people assume. This is just an inevitable part of getting older. This is arguably the most important finding. Chronic inflammation isn't an inevitable consequence of aging, it's driven overwhelmingly by modifiable lifestyle factors. The strongest evidence comes from an unlikely place, populations that don't develop it at all. Non-industrialized populations in places like Bolivia and Malaysia show minimal age-related increase in inflammatory markers. The inflammaging signature common in Western populations is virtually absent, and the disease associations we see with inflammation weren't present either. Blue zone populations, so places like Sardinia, Okinawa, and Nicoya, consistently live to 100 with low chronic disease burden. The common thread? Natural movement, plant-forward diet, strong social connection, purpose, and low chronic stress. Inflammaging isn't a feature of human aging, it's a feature of modern living. When you break down the specific drivers, there are 6 and they are all modifiable. First, visceral fat. Adipose tissue is an active endocrine organ. It continuously secretes IL-6 and TNF-alpha. The more you carry, the higher your baseline inflammation. Second, ultra-processed diets. The Dietary Inflammatory Index helps to quantify this. Researchers found those with the highest pro-inflammatory diet scores had a 4.89 times risk of bladder cancer compared to those with the lowest scores. Third, sleep deprivation. Sleep loss activates NF-kappa beta, the master switch for inflammatory gene regulation, and it significantly increases IL-6 and TNF-alpha production. The important bit, one night of recovery sleep doesn't undo the damage. The inflammation increase persisted even after a perfect full recovery night. Fourth, gut dysbiosis. When beneficial bacteria decline, butyrate production drops. The gut barrier weakens, and then bacterial endotoxins can leak into the bloodstream. This triggers toll-like receptor 4 activation and systemic inflammation. Fifth, chronic psychological stress. Experienced psychological mediators who practice mindfulness and talking therapies with an average of over 9,000 lifetime hours of practice showed significantly lower cortisol responses to stress compared to those matched controls, 63 versus 70 picograms per milliliter. They also showed lower perceived stress and smaller neurogenic inflammatory responses. Sixth, sedentary behavior. Physical inactivity accelerates mitochondrial dysfunction, increases reactive oxygen species, and activates NLRP3 inflammasome, what we talked about earlier. A direct pipeline from sitting on the couch to the vicious cycle we just discussed. The standard modern lifestyle, so things like processed food, poor sleep, chronic stress, and not enough movement, starting to sound a bit familiar, is basically an inflammation generating machine. But every single one of those inputs is modifiable. So, those are the three findings. Now, as promised, what does the evidence say actually works? The interventions that actually lower chronic inflammation. First up is exercise, the most robust intervention that we examine here. A meta-analysis pooling 31 studies with over 1,500 elderly participants found that aerobic exercise, resistance training, combined training, and HIIT all significantly reduced IL-6, TNF-alpha, and CRP. Resistance exercise was particularly effective for CRP reduction, HIIT for TNF-alpha, and combined aerobic resistance training for IL-6. But what about people who have been training their entire lives? What's termed as master athletes, or people who have maintained structured training throughout adulthood? They show CRP reduced by a standard mean difference of minus 0.71, and their anti-inflammatory IL-10 was elevated by 1.44 compared to the age-matched sedentary peers. But even lifelong exercisers still showed elevated TNF-alpha and IL-6 versus young adults, a sign that even consistent exercise couldn't fully reverse the process. Exercise is the closest thing we have to an anti-inflammatory drug with no side effects. It doesn't fully reverse inflammaging, but nothing does. It does, however, attenuate it more consistently than anything else. Next up, we have the Mediterranean diet. This has a strong evidence base behind it. 19 large prospective studies showed benefits for reducing heart attack, stroke, total mortality, heart failure, and disability. The lesson is to stop chasing individual anti-inflammatory foods and eat in a way that's anti-inflammatory as an entire system. So things like vegetables, fruit, olive oil, nuts, legumes, fish, with minimally processed foods. Next up, sleep optimization, consistency over duration. Here's what most people get wrong about sleep and inflammation. It's not about one perfect night. Sleep deprivation activates TLR4 or toll-like receptor 4 signaling and produces significant increases in IL-6 and TNF-alpha. And critically, this persisted even after a full recovery night. Your body doesn't reset, the inflammatory effects accumulate. So the practical target isn't 8 hours once in a while, it's consistent sleep windows. Same bedtime, same wake time, 7 nights a week. If you're currently getting 6 hours on weeknights and 9 hours on a weekend, that irregularity pattern is likely doing more inflammatory damage than the short sleep itself. Calorie restricting and intermittent fasting. Calorie restriction activates AMPK, inhibits mTOR, and induces autophagy, the cellular clearance process that removes damaged organelles and suppresses inflammasome activity. Intermittent fasting shows promising reductions in IL-6, TNF-alpha, and CRP, with effects mediated through metabolic remodeling and enhanced autophagy. It's promising, but the long-term data in older and frail adults is still limited. It's worth considering, but exercise and dietary patterns have deeper evidence bases. Supplementation, so this is what's helpful at the margins rather than the foundations. I know a lot of people hear inflammation and immediately reach for supplements, so let me be honest about what the clinical trials actually show. Omega-3s have the strongest evidence base. A team at Ohio State tested this in 138 sedentary, overweight, middle-aged adults, and after about 4 months of supplementation between 1.25 and 2.5 grams per day, IL-6 decreased by 10 to 12%. In the placebo group, IL-6 increased by 36%, so that's a meaningful difference. But hold on there. The Do Health trial, which is Europe's largest healthy aging study, had 2,100 participants aged 70 and over. They found that omega-3 at 1 gram per day did not reduce major cardiovascular events in already healthy, active older adults. So, omega-3 genuinely might help if you're sedentary or overweight, but in people already doing the things on the list, the additional benefit is less clear. Probiotics and prebiotics show modest but real effects. A meta-analysis of 29 trials found that prebiotics increased anti-inflammatory IL-10 and symbiotics reduced TNF-alpha. That makes mechanistic sense given the gut inflammation axis we discussed earlier. Curcumin modulates the right pathways in theory, but the bioavailability is extremely poor. Most of it passes straight through, even with specialized formulations. The gap between what curcumin does in a petri dish and what it does in your bloodstream is significant. Bottom line is supplements can help at the margin, but they can't override a pro-inflammatory lifestyle. Everything above this point on the list matters far more. Chronic inflammation is the silent upstream driver connecting heart disease, cognitive decline, cancer, and accelerated aging. The evidence shows that it's measurable, modifiable, and far more important than most people realize. If this interested you and you want to understand how to optimize exercise for longevity beyond just inflammation, I made a video which goes deep into the research and I'll link it somewhere up here. As always, I've linked all studies referenced into this video into a citation library. It's free and you can find it in the description below. Let me know in the comments what you want me to cover next, but until next time, look after yourselves.